They thought I wouldn't show up. They thought the weight of shame would keep me away. I had stared at the invitation for what felt like hours, but really, it was just minutes. It sat there on the polished metal desk like it had no idea what it carried. A crisp white envelope, its edges embossed in gold, my name printed in bold letters, Lieutenant General Rebecca Cole. Whoever had written it on the outside clearly had no clue that I hadn't been Rebecca to this family for years. The seal was intact. I could almost feel the weight of my past pressing against it. A life that was a distant memory, now reappearing in a neat, polite envelope. I knew what was inside before I even opened it. Haley was getting married. Not just married, she was marrying Major Andrew Foster. The irony hit me like a bullet. 6 years had passed since I last heard from my family. Not a birthday, not a condolence, not a word when I nearly lost my hearing during my second deployment. Only silence. And now this, a formal invitation that wasn't sent with warmth but with a single word stamped on it: behave. The base in Stuttgart was unusually quiet that afternoon. The wind was pushing against the flagpole, making it creak like it was trying to resist. The room around me was sterile, familiar, disciplined, the way I'd built my life. Steel bed, pressed uniforms, a locked trunk filled with memories nobody would ever touch. I held the invitation in my hands, turning it over and over, waiting for it to reveal something more, something different, but it didn't. The knock on my door came. A double rap, crisp and professional. "Simmons." "General," he said, nodding to the invitation in my hand. "I heard." "Of course you did," I replied, not even bothering to answer his unasked question. Simmons had been with me since my early days in the Army. He knew the kind of silence I wore. He didn't need to ask why it mattered. "Going?" he asked, and for the first time I slid the invitation across the table to him. He read the gold-embossed letters aloud: Foster. His voice was neutral, but his eyes told the truth. He knew. "That's the kid you pulled out of that crater in Helmand, right?" he asked quietly. I nodded, my voice clipped and steady. "Same one. You saved his life, and now he's marrying your sister," Simmons said, leaning back in his chair. "You think you're going for the war or the ghosts?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let his words hang in the air. Finally, I said, "Maybe just to watch one burn." He didn't smile. "Then go. But don't wear your stars like armor," he said, his voice almost like a prayer. "Wear them like memory. Let them remember who you became without them." His words hung in the air long after he left. I turned the invitation over again, staring at the embossed letters. I walked to the window, staring down at the training field below. New recruits, running drills with energy, ambition, and naivety. I envied them for a moment. They didn't know what it was like to be broken down and rebuilt, to be forgotten, discarded, and rebuilt again. I went to the closet and pulled out the dress uniform, the one I hadn't worn since my father's funeral. The one I hadn't been able to speak at. I laid it flat on the bed, smoothing the sleeves as if they were wounds I hadn't wanted to remember. That day came back to me sharper than I expected. My father had been buried with full honors. The Marine Corps band, the 21-gun salute, but there was no seat for me in the front row. My mother had sat between Haley and Uncle Roy, her lips pressed into a bitter line. When I approached, my mother didn't even look up. Haley glanced at me briefly, her eyes unreadable, before turning back to the ceremony as if I were just another uniform out of place. I stood the entire time. Afterwards, my mother had placed a hand on my arm and said, "You shouldn't have come in uniform. It makes it look like you're trying to upstage the family." The family? I remembered walking away. I hadn't turned back since. Now here I was, 6 years later, holding a wedding invitation that felt like a punch disguised as an olive branch. Andrew Foster. The man who, of all people, was marrying my sister. He, of all people, was tying himself to the woman who once told me I was a disgrace to the Cole name. I thought of the night in Helmand, the explosion, the dust, the twisted steel. Andrew's leg nearly severed. I crawled across open ground to reach him, blood in my mouth, shrapnel lodged in my shoulder. I still had the scar. He whispered, "I owe you," before they airlifted him out, and now he was marrying Haley. The irony was suffocating. I opened my laptop and started looking up flight schedules, quietly pushing aside the memories, making arrangements. I wasn't going to be welcomed. I was going to be seen, for the first time in years. After 3 years of saving Andrew Foster's life, I would now show up to watch him marry the woman who had nearly destroyed mine. The plane was a little too cold, the air too still. The hum of the engines felt too mechanical, like the entire journey was happening without me, and I was simply an observer in my own life. I was heading back, heading to where it all started, to the place that had broken me, and where I had learned to break in return. The seat beside me was empty. I had paid extra to make sure it stayed that way. I didn't want any company. Not on the flight, not in the space between the clouds where my thoughts would race faster than the plane. I didn't want anyone's well-meaning questions, no sympathetic glances. I wanted to be left alone with my memories, my scars, my regrets. I had heard the whispers for years, the comments from old classmates, the forwarded emails, the gossip that made its way through channels I never bothered to monitor. Haley was getting married to Andrew Foster. The very man I had saved from certain death, the one I had crawled through hell to pull out of a minefield, was now going to be bound to the very woman who had erased me from this family's history. I stared out the window, the vast stretch of the Atlantic below. Everything felt like a dream, the kind where you're running and never quite reaching your destination. There was no satisfaction in coming back. No hope of a reconciliation, only the weight of unfinished business. The flight attendant passed by, offering drinks. I asked for water. The champagne didn't interest me. The small talk, the smiling, the empty niceties, all of it felt like a mask I had long ago outgrown. They didn't understand. No one did. Not even Andrew, despite the debt of life he owed me. The flight continued, an unbroken line of time spent in the air. Every minute felt like it was dragging me closer to the past. The past I couldn't shake. The people I couldn't leave behind, no matter how hard I tried. By the time we landed, I could already feel the weight of my return. Dulles International Airport, with its fluorescent lights and the sharp scent of antiseptic, felt strangely familiar. But it wasn't home. Home had long ago abandoned me. I moved through customs quickly, showing my military ID without a second thought. I didn't need to explain who I was. The system recognized me instantly. But outside, I felt like a stranger. A ghost in a uniform. I didn't belong here, not in this world of families and laughter and wedding dresses. My phone buzzed in my pocket, an unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail out of spite, but curiosity won out. I answered. Well, you actually came? It was Haley. Her voice was as sweet as ever, that lilt of innocence hiding the bitterness I knew too well. You didn't think I would? I asked, already walking toward the escalator. You didn't say anything for 6 years, she replied too brightly. So this is progress. I didn't respond, but I could hear the amusement in her tone, the subtle mockery that I had come to expect. I came because I was invited, I said finally. Haley laughed lightly. Right, because Mom guilted you into it. I didn't answer, but I could hear her smiling. I wasn't sure if I was still angry or just numb to her, the woman who had once torn me apart with just a few words. Well, Andrew's looking forward to seeing you, Haley chirped. You two always had chemistry. I stopped walking. The words hit harder than I expected. That's not funny, I said, my voice steady, but it felt like a weight on my chest. I didn't mean it to be, she replied, but I could hear the smile in her voice, that smile, the one she used to destroy me without anyone noticing. I didn't reply. Instead, I ended the call and continued walking. The airport was bustling, the sound of voices and rolling suitcases filling the air. But I was silent. In this moment, all that mattered was the quiet I had been living with for years. Outside, the Virginia spring was in full bloom. Dogwoods and cherry blossoms lined the streets, their pale flowers drifting gently in the breeze. The city was picturesque, pristine. A postcard come to life. I didn't take the freeway. I let the driver take me through the old neighborhoods I used to know, the streets where I had ridden my bike as a child, back when I was still Becky, before the army, before everything had changed. When we reached the cul-de-sac, I spotted Mrs. Langford, the neighbor with the perfect hydrangeas and the eyes that always seemed to see too much. She was watering her garden, a hose coiled at her feet. She looked up when she saw me, her eyes narrowing. Rebecca, she called like she hadn't seen me in years. Hi, Mrs. Langford, I said, stepping out of the car and adjusting my duffel on my shoulder. Well, my goodness, you're still in the military, she said, blinking at my uniform. I smiled, but it wasn't a real smile. Yes, ma'am, she nodded slowly, eyes trailing over my rank. I thought you might have, well, left after everything. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked past her without waiting for an answer. The house was just as I remembered it, too perfect, too polished, too quiet. The shutters were freshly painted, the driveway clean, and the porch light flickered like it was holding its breath. The house looked like it hadn't aged a day, I rang the doorbell. There was a long pause before I heard footsteps. The door opened and the smell hit me first, lemon polish, my mother's signature scent. Every surface in that house had been scrubbed until it gleamed with disapproval. Barbara stood in the doorway. She was dressed in beige slacks and a pearl-colored blouse, her hair pulled back tightly, not a strand out of place. Her eyes flicked over my uniform and the silence between us grew thick. "Please don't ruin this for Haley," she said, her voice sharp and controlled. I didn't say anything. I just walked past her and into the house. I wasn't there for her. I wasn't there for them. I was there because I had been invited. And they had no idea what I was about to remind them of. The house was as pristine as I remembered, every corner polished, every surface meticulously cared for. It was the same place that had once been home, but now it felt like a museum to a family I no longer belonged to. The air was thick with the smell of lemon polish and something else, an undertone of discomfort, of pretense. It had always been this way, hadn't it? Polished, perfect, but hollow. Barbara led me inside, her voice as controlled as ever, as if she had learned how to trap her emotions in a box and lock them away. She didn't ask how I'd been, didn't make any mention of the years I'd spent in service or the struggles I had faced. She simply offered the same polite, strained smile she had worn for years. "Your seat's already waiting for you," she said, her tone far too bright. "Haley's so excited to see you." I didn't respond. Instead, I followed her through the house, my boots echoing against the polished floors. My mind was elsewhere, lost in the years that had passed since I last set foot here. The laughter, the family dinners, the conversations that were never mine to be part of. All of it felt like it belonged to someone else. We entered the dining room, and I could feel the weight of the room's cold formality as soon as I stepped through the door. The chandelier overhead cast a soft, golden glow on the polished mahogany table. It was set for 15, but there was an unmistakable absence in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the one person who had been erased from the picture. My seat was at the far end of the table, next to the sideboard, away from the family, away from Haley. I pulled out the chair and it creaked under me as I sat down. I could feel the eyes of the room on me, but nobody spoke. No welcome back, Rebecca, no mention of the rank I carried. The silence spoke louder than any words could. Haley sat at the other end of the table, a perfect picture of the bride-to-be. Her silk blouse shimmered in the light, and she laughed too loudly at something our cousin Grant had said. The laughter was sharp, but she didn't notice. I noticed everything. How could I not? For years, I had been nothing more than a shadow in this family, someone who was always in the background, never truly seen. Barbara floated around the table, filling wine glasses and making small talk, her pearls catching the light with each movement. She glanced at me briefly, but it was clear that I wasn't supposed to be there, not in my uniform, not with my past, not with my rank. I could see it in her eyes, the disapproval simmering just beneath the surface. She didn't even acknowledge my presence until she had to. "To family," she said, raising her glass, "to new beginnings." The room echoed her words, but they didn't land, not with me, not with the years of silence that had built up between us. I looked down at my glass of water, the only thing in front of me. The wine hadn't reached my side of the table. Maybe it never would. Haley caught my eye across the table, and her smile faltered for just a second. It was a brief moment, barely noticeable, but I saw it. I always did. It was the same look she had given me when I stood at my father's funeral, an unreadable expression before she turned back to the ceremony, ignoring me like I was nothing more than a ghost. The conversation around me continued, but it felt distant, like I wasn't even part of it. I wasn't a sister. I wasn't family. I was just the one who had been forgotten, relegated to the edge of their perfect little world. "So," Haley said, her voice suddenly turning too bright again, "how long are you here for, Becky? Or are you on call to guard a missile silo or something?" The words were sharp, cutting, and the laughter that followed from the table was not kind. It wasn't funny. It wasn't even a joke. It was a reminder. A reminder of the years I had spent serving while they lived their lives, untouched by the sacrifices I had made. I set my glass of water down slowly. "The people I guard," I said, my voice steady and deliberate, outrank this entire room. The laughter faltered. The silence between us grew thick and uncomfortable. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be, but it was there. And for the first time in years, I wasn't the invisible one. I wasn't the forgotten sister. I was seen, and that was more powerful than any rank, any title I could ever wear. The silence was broken by the sound of a glass clinking, the sound of an apology unspoken, and the realization that they had underestimated me. All of them. They thought I wouldn't show up. They thought I would remain silent forever, but I wasn't their ghost. I was still here, standing in the room they had tried to bury me from, and now they would have to reckon with the truth I brought with me. The dinner dragged on, each course served in careful silence. The conversations, when they occurred, were laced with polite disinterest. I could feel the eyes on me, darting quickly away whenever I looked up. No one was brave enough to approach me. No one dared to ask why I had come or how it felt to be the one left behind. When the main course was finished, Barbara stood up, signaling the transition to the next phase of the evening. She looked at me briefly, as if measuring whether I would comply with the unspoken rules of this family gathering. I was the outsider here. I wasn't supposed to be present. This wasn't for me, but I was here and I wasn't going anywhere, not yet. "Let's head over to the church," she said, her voice crisp. "It's time." I didn't reply. I simply stood and followed her out of the house, my boots clacking against the driveway. The air outside was cool, fresh with the hint of spring. It felt like a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside the house. There was nothing to hold me here, no reason to stay. But still, I followed. As the car drove through the familiar streets, I felt a deep sense of distance. The houses were neatly lined, their lawns perfectly manicured. This was the world they lived in, tidy, controlled, and oblivious to the cracks that ran deep beneath the surface. The same cracks that had shaped me into who I was. The same cracks that would never heal, no matter how much they tried to cover them with smiles and good intentions. The church was just as pristine as I remembered. White lilies lined the altar, and the soft strains of a violin filled the air as I stepped inside. It was beautiful in its own way, too perfect like everything else they touched, but I didn't care about the beauty. I didn't care about the ceremony. I cared about what was happening beneath the surface. I found my seat, at the back, away from the family, away from Haley, just as expected. My seat wasn't even listed on the program. No rank, no acknowledgement, just Rebecca. The woman they pretended didn't exist. They thought they could erase me just like they had erased so many other things about me. But here I was, still standing, still breathing, still refusing to disappear. The ceremony began and I watched them. I watched Haley as she floated down the aisle, her white dress shimmering like a beacon, drawing all eyes toward her. She smiled, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was a smile of possession, of control. She was taking what she wanted and she would never let go. Andrew stood at the altar, his back straight, his face unreadable. He didn't look like the man I had saved in Helmand. He looked like someone who had buried all the truth of that night deep within him. He had forgotten what I had done for him, or maybe he hadn't. Maybe he just didn't care anymore. The priest began speaking, and I half listened, my thoughts drifting as I stared at the scene unfolding in front of me. I didn't belong here. I didn't belong in this room, in this family, in this story. They had written me out long ago, and yet here I was, a character they couldn't erase. When it was time for the blessing, I stood up, almost without thinking. It was a reflex, something I had done 1,000 times before when I was still a soldier, still trying to fit into a world that never quite accepted me. But before I could move forward, Barbara's hand was on my arm. Her grip was firm, too firm, as if she were trying to keep me in place. "Let's not confuse things," she whispered. "This is Haley's day." I looked down at her hand, then up at her. The words stung, but I didn't let them show. Instead, I lowered my eyes and sat back down. The ceremony continued, the violin playing softly in the background. The guests around me dabbed their eyes, the tears fake, the emotions rehearsed. The truth hung heavy in the air, but no one dared speak it. Not yet. The ceremony ended quickly, and people began to file out toward the reception. The laughter and chatter filled the air again, but I felt more alone than ever. I had been pushed to the edges, not physically, but emotionally. They wanted to pretend I wasn't there. They wanted to act like I didn't matter. But I did. I mattered. At the reception, my seat was waiting for me at the far end of the room, behind a pillar. The place card read R. Cole, the initials small and insignificant. It didn't even bother to mention my rank, my history, or the things I had done. I didn't matter here, not to them, but I wasn't here for them. I sat down and watched the celebration unfold. Haley laughed too loudly, as if she was trying to make sure everyone noticed her. Andrew stayed by her side, his hand possessively on her lower back, but he didn't look at me. Not once. It didn't matter. I wasn't there for them, I was here for me. To prove that I could still stand, that I could still exist in this world that had tried so hard to forget me. Then, it happened. The moment they'd been dreading. Haley took the microphone, her voice dripping with sweetness as she addressed the room. She scanned the crowd, her eyes flicking over me, and then she smiled that smile, the one she used to mask everything she had done. "So," she began, her voice carrying over the room, "how long are you here for, Becky? Or are you on call to guard a missile silo or something?" The room laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh, it was sharp, cutting, a reminder of what they thought of me, of who I had been. I didn't move, I didn't react. Instead, I stood slowly, deliberately. The room quieted as they realized I wasn't going to let this go. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to make a scene, I simply spoke. "The people I guard," I said, "outrank this entire room." The room was silent. Haley's smile faltered. It was brief, but it was enough. They had underestimated me. They had thought I would remain silent, that I would play along. But I wasn't going to let them rewrite my story. Not anymore. The room was still, frozen in that single, defining moment. I stood there, not with anger or defiance, but with something more, something they had forgotten in their rush to bury me. Power. The kind that doesn't shout but simply is. Haley's smile had vanished entirely. She tried to speak, to laugh it off, but her voice trembled. "Oh, come on," she said, the words escaping her lips like a futile attempt to regain control. "It's just a joke. Lighten up, Rebecca. You always took everything so seriously." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The truth was already out. The silence between us stretched, thick and suffocating, while the weight of my name, the name they had erased, settled on the room like a heavy fog. I could feel the eyes of every guest on me now, but I didn't look away. I didn't flinch. They had made their assumptions about me, but now they were the ones squirming. And then Andrew moved. It wasn't fast. It wasn't dramatic. He simply stood up, his movements deliberate, his face set in an unreadable mask. For a brief moment, I thought he might come to my defense, say something, anything. But instead, he walked across the room, past the tables, past the laughter, past the people who had all whispered behind my back. And he stopped in front of me. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply gave a sharp, crisp salute, the kind of salute I had seen 1,000 times in the field, a gesture that wasn't for family, wasn't for friends. It was for those who had earned it. The kind of salute that meant respect, that meant "I see you." "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady, clear, carrying across the room. "Andrew Foster, reporting." The room fell into complete silence, the kind that wasn't awkward, but stunned. The guests didn't know what to do. Haley's face was pale, her mouth slightly open, her hand still holding the microphone as if it had turned into something heavy and unmanageable. She had thought this was her moment, her wedding, her spotlight, but she had forgotten one thing: this was my story too. Andrew's eyes met mine, but he didn't look away. There was no apology in his gaze, no regret, just acknowledgement. The kind I had waited for, the kind I had earned all those years ago when I crawled through that hell in Hellman to pull him from the fire. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. His salute had already spoken volumes. And with that, he turned, his back straight, walking back to Haley, who was still frozen in place. The silence lingered for what felt like an eternity. And then, slowly, the gasps began. People murmured, exchanging confused glances, unsure of what had just happened. They weren't sure whether to cheer, to apologize, or to pretend nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The room wasn't the same anymore. The power dynamics had shifted, and it wasn't just because of Andrew's salute. It was because I had reminded them all of something they had forgotten. I wasn't just the disgraced daughter. I wasn't just the soldier who had been discarded. I was Rebecca Cole. And no matter how hard they tried to erase me, I was always going to be there, standing in the room, taking up space. Barbara was the first to break the silence. She stood abruptly, knocking over a flute of champagne in her haste. "Rebecca," she started, her voice trembling beneath a veneer of authority. "This isn't the time." But it was too late. The moment had already passed. The cracks had already formed, and there was no way to patch them up now. The truth had been laid bare. Haley stood, her hands shaking as she tried to regain her composure. She began, but her words were cut off by the sharp, resounding thud of her microphone hitting the floor. The sound was louder than anything she could say. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The room was still. The orchestra had stopped. The photographers, who had been frantically snapping pictures of the bride and groom, now hovered awkwardly, unsure of what to capture. The only thing they could see was me, the woman they had tried to bury, now standing tall in the center of the room. Then, from the second row of tables, a man stood. He was a retired colonel, his posture still sharp, his eyes hard with understanding. "General Cole," he said, his voice clear and respectful. "It's good to see you." One by one, others stood. General Park, a former lecturer at West Point, rose to his feet, followed by a woman in her 50s who had served in the army for decades. Then another and another. Slowly, the room came to its senses. The people who had been in the background, the ones who understood the weight of a salute, the weight of respect, they were standing for me. Barbara's hand twitched, but she didn't reach for the napkin that had fallen from her lap. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Haley was frozen, a shell of the woman who had mocked me just moments before, and I was still standing. No one said a word, but the room had shifted. The game had changed. The air in the ballroom was thick now, the kind of tension that settles deep in your bones and refuses to let go. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, still buzzing in the silence left behind by Andrew's salute. The faces I had known for years, the family that had never truly seen me, were now confronted by a truth they couldn't ignore. I stood there, unmoving, feeling the raw energy in the room shift. It wasn't just about respect anymore. It was about power. And for the first time in years, I realized I had the power here, not because of my rank, but because I had refused to be erased. I had refused to be silenced. Haley was still standing at the altar, the microphone clutched tightly in her hand, her face pale, her eyes wide. The smile that had once been so practiced now looked like a mask, falling away to reveal something far more vulnerable. She hadn't expected this. None of them had. The facade was gone, and in its place was nothing but raw, uncomfortable truth. I could feel Barbara's eyes on me. She was standing near the edge of the room, her posture still perfect, but her hands trembling. She had always been the one in control, the one who shaped the world around her to fit her needs. But now, she was the one out of place. Her world was cracking, and she didn't know how to stop it. The sound of heels clicking on the marble floor broke the silence. A reporter, young and eager, stood up from her seat, her camera already trained on me. "General Cole," she called, her voice cutting through the tension. "Can we get a statement? What was that about?" I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. Instead, I walked toward her, slowly, deliberately, making my way through the sea of uncomfortable faces. When I reached the center of the room, I turned to face everyone, my back straight, my gaze unwavering. "I don't need to give you a statement," I said, my voice calm but carrying enough weight to silence the room. "I'm not here for headlines or apologies. I'm here because I deserve to be seen, because I choose when my story is told, not anyone else." The reporter's pen hovered over her notebook, but she didn't write anything. She simply stared at me, unsure of what to say next. The room, on the other hand, was alive with whispers. Some of them were shocked, some were curious, but all of them were now looking at me differently. Haley, still clutching the microphone, looked like she might faint. Her face was drained of color, her eyes locked on me as if seeing me for the first time. "I didn't mean," she started, but I cut her off before she could finish. "You didn't mean what?" I asked, my voice sharp, not out of anger, but out of something much colder. "You didn't mean to humiliate me, to erase me from this family's history. You didn't mean to throw me away the moment I became inconvenient to your perfect little life." She opened her mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. Instead, she stepped back, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of everything she had done to me was suddenly too much for her to carry. Andrew was still standing at the back of the room, watching us, his expression unreadable. I could see the conflict in his eyes, but I didn't care. Not anymore. I had saved his life. I had pulled him from the ashes, and in return, he had married the woman who had tried to destroy me. I turned back to the room, my eyes scanning the faces of the guests who had once been part of my world. Some of them were still standing, unsure of what to do, while others had already begun to shuffle away, retreating into their own discomfort. "Let me make something clear," I continued, my voice unwavering. "I didn't come here to fight you. I didn't come here to relive the past. I came here because I was invited. And now that I'm here, I'm not going to let you erase me again." The room was still, all eyes on me, waiting for me to say more. But I didn't need to. The truth was already hanging in the air like a thick fog, settling over everything. And then, just as I was about to turn and leave, I felt it, a shift in the energy. The tension that had filled the room began to unravel, not because anyone had apologized or made amends, but because they had finally seen the truth. They had finally recognized who I was, and in that recognition, something had changed. I didn't know what it was yet, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't invisible anymore. They couldn't ignore me. They couldn't pretend I didn't exist. And that, more than anything, was the victory I needed.